don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Christian Moore Anderson, who is a teacher and an author, and I came across him on the social platform Blue Sky, where he had published a blog piece that I thought was really thoughtful and interesting and was sort of the center of our conversation here. The title of that blog is Knowledge Doesn't Equal Understanding. As I said, our conversation centered around that blog piece and the topics therein, sort of in the context of cognitive science and science of learning principles, and some of the key distinctions that he makes, which are really interesting, I think, and useful as you think about improving and growing your teaching and learning. He does have a couple books that are worth mentioning, and I do talk about those, but not until later in the podcast. One of those is Biology Made Real, Ways of Teaching That Inspire Meaning Making, and we talk quite a bit about meaning making in this podcast. And then the other is Difference Maker, Enacting Systems Theory in Biology Teaching. Both of those books are obviously specific to biology, but as you'll hear us talk, at least one of them is applicable, at least in his mind, to subjects outside of biology. Again, I really enjoyed this conversation, and we got into some of the things that I think are really, really important, away from the false dichotomies of sort of transmission versus discovery and what he would call co-constructionism. So as always, I hope you find it helpful as you think about your teaching and learning. And for those of you who are interested in professional learning and professional development, please don't forget to check out our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, and it has all of our professional development workshops and professional learning opportunities. I'd also like to take a moment to mention that we have some events coming up that are open for registration. One, which is in our Thought Stretchers education community, we'll have a conversation with Josh Cowan and Neil McCluskey, both who have been on the podcast talking about school choice and vouchers. That is School Choice and Vouchers, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That is January 28th. We also have early bird registration open for our summer PBL conference, which is PBL Grow 25. That will be June 23rd through 25th here in our hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. And again, early bird registration is open for that. And we are also offering a Foundations of PBL online cohort blended workshop, which will run from January 13th to February 13th. This will be a mix and a unique opportunity to engage in learning about PBL, where you'll design a project for implementation with your students, and mix synchronous and asynchronous learning, where you'll have an opportunity to view the content of our PBL on-demand online workshop and schedule one-on-one sessions with me to sort of consolidate that learning and ask questions and think more about your project-based learning understanding, as well as share your project with the cohort members in our Thought Stretchers education community. All of those and all of our blog content and podcasts are available at wegrowteachers.com. And if you have questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. A brief apology for some audio issues with my audio. The microphone and a few spots seem to be not picking up the audio correctly. There's some crackling and some dropping. I did actually overdub a few of the spots, so you may notice those, and then you'll notice a few spots here and there, mostly right towards the beginning and then a little bit towards the end where it's a little crackly and not quite as clear. I apologize for that. We've ordered a new microphone, and hopefully that won't be a problem going forward. And now here's my conversation with Christian. I am with Christian Moore Anderson, and we're going to talk about knowledge and understanding, and more than that. His work is not limited to that, but there's a blog piece in particular that I had seen actually on Blue Sky, which I'm fairly new at. I don't know how long you've been there, but it's an interesting place as opposed to the Twitter X and landscape there. But as I usually want to do, give you an opportunity, Christian, to introduce yourself, and thanks for being here. But tell the folks who you are and what you do, and maybe what you think is important for them to know.
So I'm Christian. I'm a full-time biology teacher, and I've been teaching in England, and now I teach in a kind of hybrid British Spanish school in Barcelona. And a lot of my work originally just focused around biology teaching, and then slowly but surely that kind of got me deeply into the biology of cognition, which I think is quite distinct from kind of computational metaphors of learning. And then from there, it was down the rabbit hole. So a lot of my work now, it's in the arena of biology teaching, but I think it's much more applicable to learning itself. I don't study at a university. I just do it because I'm interested in it.
Gotcha. And where did you do your pre-service teaching, like
I
pre-service
studied.
education?
Well, I mean, I started teaching English first in South America. After university, and I knew that I liked it, so I went back to where I'm from, and studied in the University of Manchester to be a teacher. And then I worked in Manchester for a few years, and then I met my wife, who is Spanish, and we moved over to Barcelona and spent my time there. So I did a master's degree in education at Bath University, and it was there that I started digging deeper into this biology and realized how my subject was more than just teaching biology, but it overlapped a lot with being a person, and that meant cognition itself.
Hmm. And what was your pre-university? I guess here in States we call it K-12, but what was that experience like for you? Where was it, and what kind of education? How would you sort of characterize the experience?
So just my normal school. I'm from a town near Manchester, so I just went to the local school, and did all the way up to 18 years old there. And I think it was just kind of like your normal bog standard education. Some of the teachers were good, some were not so good. It's very, very different to how schools run nowadays. I think there was much less vigilance. Like nobody was too bothered if you did your homework. You just kind of you just passed every year in every topic, one to the next, and you just got a grade, and nobody was really bothered about what was going on. I think nowadays in schools, kids are so monitored that it's a very different environment.
And how would you characterize your pre-service teacher education? I'm curious because in the States there's a regular debate about the quality of teacher preparation.
We have that. I see that debate is a big thing in the UK as well. I think it's hard to tell because we actually spent a lot of time in schools. I think in the debate in the UK, there's quite a bit of people blaming universities for certain things, for not teaching my favorite theory or something like this. But if I think back, we spent most of our time in schools, and that meant we were with the teachers, and a lot of the responsibility was actually with the teachers who you were with. And then the problem with that is it depends on the school you get and the teachers you got and how much they knew. The teachers that I worked with were actually quite relatively new to teaching themselves. They'd only been teaching maybe 5-6 years. My mentor had been teaching 4 years. So I suppose a big part of the problem is the retention crisis that we've got. If teachers are going to be trained in schools with teachers, then a lot of it depends on the quality of teacher you get, and that's difficult.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about here, and it came to my attention on Blue Sky, and we exchanged a bit of an exchange there, but the blog piece that you published on December 2nd, which is titled Knowledge Doesn't Equal Understanding, I wonder if you might unpack and kind of give us an overview of what you mean by this blog and the sort of takeaways, especially in the context of teaching and learning.
I think if we maybe it'd be very good to begin with like a distinction that I've come to see as like maybe the most important distinction, and This is where we go back to the difference between the biology of cognition and the computational metaphor. And that's that living organisms make meaning and computers don't. And that means the computer, if you are very fixed on a computational metaphor, you can see this idea that computers gain data, and that data can be seen as knowledge. You can put data into a computer, and the computer can do something with that data, and then that forms a kind of epistemology of the teacher. It's like, oh, this is how learning happens. But if you look at organisms, then it's very different. And if you look at an active cognitive science is a part of cognitive science which is based on biology, and it looks more at the idea of meaning making and how when organisms first came about, that's when meaning making became a thing in the universe. Because when they first came about, the meaning was, is this good for me or is it bad for me in terms of survival? And then the idea is that we still work off these kind of ideas of meaning, like, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for my identity or what I can do with it? I think this is a good first distinction that'll help us talk, is this idea that if we're not computers, then you cannot just plug in data into us, like you can with a computer. So it's the idea that meaning cannot be transmitted. Like a computer, you can put data in, the data can be used by the computer, but a teacher can give knowledge as such to a student and they can repeat it. But the meaning of that knowledge is something very personal, that cannot be transmitted from one person to another. So that's where a lot of my this distinction for me holds real sway. I think there's quite a bit of science behind it. It was in information theory, Shannon's information theory, back in the 40s when they were doing telecommunications, and it was in that theory where they were looking at messages going from one place to another, and he said in that theory that what's sent from one communicator to another is signals, and not meaning. And that's where it really came across, like even in a mathematical theory, that the meaning itself has to be made by the person. So then if we stick with that, if we stick with that distinction, and I think that's like where we can explore what this means. If meaning cannot be transmitted in any form, we could say like the person is kind of closed to meaning, not open to meaning. It's kind of similar to the donkey metaphor, isn't it? We can lead a donkey to water, but you can't get it to drink, I think that is a real core distinction that I came across more recently. But this work really goes back. If I could give you like a little anecdote, when teaching biology, and this was earlier in my career, and I was teaching year 7, so that's like 11-year-olds, first year of secondary school. And the first topic that's always taught is cells. And I just started teaching and teaching about cells, and I was saying, showing pictures and saying this is what they are and what they're doing. And I just stopped for a moment and looked around the room, and you could just see it in their faces that they had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. In other words, it was just meaningless for them. It was just lots of words, lots of pictures, and people could call that knowledge if they want, like I was giving them knowledge, but absolutely meaningless for them. And that was a key moment in my career. And I stopped the lesson at that moment and started talking about instead meaning, like what the hell are we talking about? That sort of conversation. So what was your original question? So it was knowledge and understanding, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was just sort of an encapsulation, or maybe an elevator pitch for like the overview of that blog that I'd referred to, that knowledge and understanding, and
okay.
distinctions there?
Yeah, so so we started quite well. But there has been in the UK some people, and I've seen recently that they still agree with this, that they think that knowledge equals understanding, like it's some sort of mathematical equation. And they argue then, if you want to call it an equation, then you could say, how do you increase understanding? Well, if knowledge equals understanding, you just give more knowledge. Somebody who understands more is just somebody who knows more. And I've seen people claim that this is a more serious argument because there's no mystical thing called understanding. It's just knowledge, as if knowledge itself wasn't mystical, as if we fully understand knowledge. But they're saying that it's just knowledge. So if they know lots of things, that is understanding. And you don't have to invoke a second thing. You can just reduce it down to just one thing, which is knowledge. Which in the blog post, I parallel with quite a few instances in biology where this sort of thing has happened before, and in the end doesn't seem to have worked out. The case was vitalism. And vitalism was where in the past people wanted to explain organisms and why organisms are different to, say, rocks and other non-living things. And half of the world was more reductionist, and they wanted to say that that living things were just mechanical parts. And there was these other people who just felt like this just cannot explain what we experience. There's this personal experience that isn't explained by this argument. So the only way that they could explain it back then, when we knew much less, was this idea of a kind of spirit, a vital spirit that gave the matter some sort of life. And they were ridiculed in the same way that this argument of knowledge equals understanding. It's the idea that, like, what is a vital spirit, this mystical thing? It's easier if we just reduce down and say you're just a bunch of matter. You're just like a clock or something, that's got some sort of mechanism. And I think that is a very similar argument to what people are saying about knowledge and understanding, where it's a kind of reductionist approach, where which I think is convenient for a convenient argument, because it can simplify lots of things, but it's not actually. I think most people would agree that that's not their personal experience. You can speak to many people and they'll say, yeah, I know what you mean. We had to learn all of this stuff and I didn't really understand it.
Yeah, some of that I think is, you can describe it different ways, sort of contextualization, making meaning. Making meaning is something that is I think, part of the work that we do when we're working with teachers, and the making thinking visible kinds of things. Ron Richard, Project Zero from Harvard, if you're familiar with that. But I taught psychology, AP psychology, and one of the things that I thought of when you were talking is the difference between sensation and perception. We certainly all sort of sense things, and we would ostensibly sense the same things, but perceive it differently. And I've seen in cognitive science sort of arguments, debates, critiques, discussions, whatever you want to say, the distinction that you've made is thinking like the brain is like a computer, when of course it's not. And I'm curious how you think of cognitive science, and you said, the science shows this and shows that. Of course, that's what the sort of science of learning cognitive scientists would say, is like, what's the evidence? What's the evidence? What's the evidence? So how do you characterize your view or your description of sort of cognitive science or science of learning, if that's something that you use?
I think but cognitive science became a really popular thing maybe 2014, should we say, around there. And I think it blew up in the UK, probably bigger than anywhere else, from what I can tell. So if I give a bit of history to that, then that will help you understand my next point. Back then I was teaching, and I was just a new teacher in the UK, and I did see there was quite a lot of practice in the UK that was a bit dubious. And the problem was, I think, that a lot of people were just basing opinions against opinions. And some when push came to shove and some teachers really disagreed with some things they were being asked to do, they fell back on cognitive science, and that gave something. What they were searching for was some sort of objectivity against just a teacher's opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it rose as kind of like a revolution in that sort of sense. And so I'd like to say that the cog-sci that's talked about in the UK, I prefer to call it edu cog-sci, because I think cognitive science is this really big field with a really interesting history. And a lot of cognitive science is not read by teachers. They read a small part of applied cognitive science to teaching and learning. So what happened during this revolution was, I think certain theories were pulled to the fore as a way of combating what the practice that they saw. So what I'm trying to say is what we're seeing now, I think, is a selection of ideas that were chosen by a particular group of people who were quite prominent on social media. And those selection of ideas were based more on their utility back then in combating a different paradigm that was happening in the schools, and not necessarily a wide, broad base of cognitive science research from which we should be making decisions and discussing things. So we have what people think, and I think if you're quite new to it, is they'll say, cognitive science says this, or the evidence is this. But what I actually think is that is what it is. You've got this selection of ideas from cognitive science put it together to form something that is actually quite new, which is a teacher's perception of cognitive science and their classroom. And then what they're doing is they're not using the research them as it was done. They're applying it to their classroom, and they're saying, I think these ideas, if you put these ideas together in this way, this will be good for teaching. So that for me is now a new hypothesis. The person has got some ideas, put them together in the way that they want to put them together, and said that this will work to get well in the context that I know and the classrooms that I know. So that then becomes a new hypothesis, which doesn't actually have any evidence for it, if you know what I mean. That would then require new research. So if you get a laboratory study saying retrieval practice done in this way, and with this type of questions and with this type of spacing, worked in a laboratory with students from university, it's like, oh, fantastic. And then this teacher says, well, I've read these studies and it says the evidence is retrieval practice works. So what we're going to do is we're going to get every teacher in the school to do retrieval practice for 10 minutes at the beginning of every lesson. And it says the evidence supports this. And it's like, well, it doesn't really support it. The evidence is from a different context in a different way. And this is now, you're putting this into a classroom and it's in a different context. So you would have to then do further research to see if that worked. So what I want to do is make this distinction between what is actually going on in cognitive science, which is a scientific field with researchers, to interpretations made by teachers and then applied in a way that they see fit in their context. That's why I have these two words. One is I call edu-cog-sci, which is what the teachers are doing as a group, and the other is cognitive science, which is a vast field, much of which is not read by teachers at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some of the names that I'm assuming you're referring to, like Sweller, Kirshner, Engelman, the folks who are advocates and advocacy for direct and explicit instruction, and the different versions and those kinds of things. Project Follow Through is one thing that they will often say is obvious evidence that direct instruction is what we should be using sort of in a, I guess maybe the dominant form of instruction in classrooms. Am I missing anybody, or are those
No,
the names?
I mean, yeah, it's that kind of. I mean, and that's the thing. I do like, for example, here I don't know. Is Sweller a fan of Engelman? I'm not sure. And what's portrayed is there is this prominent group who've got these selection of ideas, like you say, cognitive load theory from Sweller, and then Engelman's direct instruction, and it's presented as some sort of grand theory of teaching that has all the evidence behind it. And actually, these research things are often done in silos. I think it's semi-famous that the people who did the research on retrieval practice didn't agree with the researchers of cognitive load theory. But then these two are put together by teachers and said, we've got this grand theory that works together. And actually, that grand theory is actually just the meaning that you've made of the things that you've read in your context. So yeah, there's a group of people, like you say, but like I think actually that they get put together by teachers. So that is an interpretation that they've made, the meaning they've made of their work, rather than it actually being some sort of scientific thing that Sweller's work works well with direct instruction.
So maybe it's helpful to, if I can ask you to sort of describe, and you've shared some things on social media that I think are really interesting, sort of diagrams and systems thinking, but just in a general sense, and I'm curious just to hear how you describe it. How do you, when you go about the process of designing a lesson, not a lesson, a unit, right? So an extended set, like we call them units. I don't know if you call them units, but thinking about the initial planning pieces and what that looks like, what you prioritize, how you then make the decisions of when to use any particular instructional approach, assessment approaches, those kinds of things.
A lot of my planning is done through thinking what I want students to know, but then I think the two biggest parts of teaching are, like, one is anticipation, and that's your planning, and you think you're anticipating. You're saying, I'm going to plan it like this. I'm going to draw my diagram this way because I'm anticipating this will be easier for students. But then the other half, the other side of the coin in teaching is adaptation. And I think this is the part that's changed a lot the most during my career. If we say that planning has always been happening, so we can say that's been constant. The thing that's changed a lot is that other side is adaptation, because earlier in my career I may have tried to give more and assumed that a correct answer meant that they understood what I was saying, and now it's more, there's so much you just can't plan for, because you've got to get in there, and then you just got to see what the responses are. So I really heavily think about the diagrams I want to draw in my classes, and in what order and things like this. But as soon as I get into the classroom, you've just got to talk to the kids, and you got to see, like, okay, like, so I've drawn this bit here, and it's just like, okay, but what does that mean? What are we talking about here? And then just like this, it's like a conversation emerges, and you start to work out what do they know, what meaning are they making of this, and that then you know whether you need to move forwards or backwards, or slow down, speed up. So what planning in itself is half the journey, and the other half, you got to get into the classroom, and if you don't appreciate that other part of the journey, that's when I think meaning making suffers. Because if it's just anticipation in terms of like planning, I will produce my PowerPoint and say these things, show these pictures, you're falling back on that idea again that we talked about of the transmission of knowledge, is the same as creating meaning. And that's where you just got to stop yourself. So when you say like planning, that my planning time has reduced a lot, because actually now I don't make these big PowerPoints just to pass through slide by slide. I'm planning a drawing, and I'm saying we're going to build this drawing in a lesson together, and what I do is I plan a really nice drawing that's quite easy to understand. But then when I get in the classroom, I don't present a drawing. We draw bits and we talk about it.
And just for clarification, because folks may not have seen, I think you're referring to the drawings of basically how a system works, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's things called stock and flow models, which are specific diagrams that are very useful when you're teaching a system subject, so like biology or geography or ecology, economics, business, things like this. But you could be a drawing anything. So I could just draw a leaf, which doesn't have to be a stock and flow diagram, but I'm drawing the parts of a leaf. Or it could be a cell division, and you're drawing a cell dividing. And so you're drawing it, but you're drawing it section by section, and every section you're saying like, yeah, but what's this about? What's going on here? And then the only way you can go from there is by actually responding to what students are saying, right? And that's this bringing this idea back to that meaning. We're closed to meaning. What I'm saying is just a load of words. They get to the students. The students see the words, they see my diagram, and they try to make meaning of it themselves. They can't see the meaning I'm making. I can't see the meaning they're making. So we have to talk about it. And I have to stop and say, like, what's going on here? And I have to think about the questions I can ask that can reveal their type of thinking. And then I'm like, okay, I get it now. So you're saying this means, right, okay. And then we can say, okay, right. So then I work on this idea. If you don't do this, you'll never know what meaning the students are making. When I first started doing this, it felt much more like teaching.
The transmission kind of model, or when you made that shift to sort of really addressing the understandings and making that thinking visible and being responsive. I talk with teachers about the sort of terminology I think about in planning is to really gain some clarity on the cognitive path you want them to travel, so that you're clear about where you want them to go and some of those things that you want them to think about and learn about and understand, and how you want them to think about them, because I think that's important too. And if once you have that clarity, then you can be responsive, I think, is kind of how what you're talking about there. I'm curious, do you use, like, I think it's helpful to use like Hattie's surface deep and transfer learning as a framework. I know some people, complain about Bloom's taxonomy, but of course, knowledge and understanding being sort of the bottom two pieces there. If you're looking at using it as a triangle, certainly some criticisms to be made of Bloom's taxonomy, but to me, it's a simple, easy way to sort of visualize and use as a sort of heuristic. Are those useful to you? Do you use different, there's depth of knowledge kind of frameworks, or how do you think about those distinctions?
I think I was very influenced at the start of my career by solo taxonomy. You know that one?
Yeah.
You
may describe it though, just for folks, because it's not something I don't know that a lot of folks are really familiar with.
It's quite pretty because it has like a nice drawing, and it starts like with a dot, and that's the first category, and then you've got like just one line, and then the third category is like 3 lines, and then you get to the 3 lines are connected, representing, now you've gone from just knowledge to connections between knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of goes in this order. And I found it very useful at the time, but I quickly realized that it wasn't really good enough because it was too general.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always kind of searched for something like that, and in the end, I ended up making my own for my own subject. So I have like what I call a taxonomy of understanding for biology that is specific to biology, and I published that a few years ago. Which is actually very similar to solo taxonomy in this way, where it goes from the distinction between describing and explaining. And I do a lot of work with my students in sharing what I see as understanding. Because a big thing I think is that a lot of subjects focus so much on content, and then they expect students to understand the content, but the students themselves do not understand what I think understanding is. So by saying, listen, this is the way I see it. If you can do this, I think that's good understanding. I think if we share this sort of thing with students, then you get them in the ballpark of like, oh, okay, yeah. So Mr. Moore wants me to do this, So then I have my own distinctions, which are based on the difference between description and explanation, and that's because it's quite science specific, and science is based on trying to explain things. So then, what is an explanation? And I share that with my students, and then that's basically it, the difference between description and explanation. But because it's biology, I also have two axes, 2 dimensions, and one is explaining the parts, like it could be the parts of the body, and then explaining what that would mean for the whole organism. So I use that with my students a lot, and it's not at all easy for students, and it's something that has to be, like any taxonomy of understanding, takes a lot of time and a lot of practice over many topics to really see what that means. So in a way, is that similar to Bloom's? I mean, you've got describe and you've got explain in Bloom's, haven't you?
So it's knowledge and understanding, and then you've got, I sometimes mess these up. It's so analyze, evaluate. I think synthesize, and the top is create. If you're using the triangle, and I may have messed up the order of the 3 underneath create, because to me those I tend to think about knowledge and understanding as being more specific to content, and I think your point of that understanding is different from knowledge, and importantly so, to then use that knowledge and understanding. I mean, it's not the relationship between what I would say is a sort of critical thinking, right? The synthesis, the evaluation, the analysis. You're asking questions, you're thinking about it, you're connecting, you're wondering, you're making meaning. All of those things help reinforce the knowledge and understanding. So it's a sort of back and forth, and we do a lot of project-based learning work. So we're asking students in a project-based learning context to create something, design or develop or something. So we say, well, what do we need to know and understand? And then through a project, doing some of those critical thinking kinds of pieces, which to me is how if we look at Daniel Willingham's idea of, I think he says memory is the residue of thought or thinking, something like that, which I think is certainly true. The more ways we can have students think about things brings more connections and ways to retrieve and ways to connect, and sort of avenues to get that retrieval, which in lots of ways is a very academic outcome, right? It's like, let's make sure that they can retrieve it so that we can measure it, and then say that it's learned. But in a life sense, like, is it usable? And I think that's one of your points, right? Is it something that we can then use in some way, shape, or form to help us do other things?
Yeah, I mean, that the I suppose I forgot to say, which is quite crucial really, is that taxonomy that I made for between describing and explaining is actually used asking students what if questions. So I make quite a big distinction in my latest book, which is important for science teaching. Is one was restating an explanation, and that's different to inferring an explanation. And I think much of science education is based on restating an explanation. So that's a teacher says, I'm going to teach you about this. This is how this works. So that's your explanation of how it works. And then you get to a test, and the question is, how does this work? And then they basically have to restate the explanation as it was given. So a lot of what my classroom is based on is actually inference. So that requires making a model in which students can think with. because you're going to say to them, listen, we've learned about this leaf, okay? And we've learned about how all of this is adapted. Well, but what if it was twice as thick? What if you were walking down and you saw a plant and its leaves were twice as thick as normal? What would happen? And that requires them then to use the knowledge that they've got in some sort of new way. And we do a lot of that. We do a lot of that in lessons, and a lot of my tests are have some of these questions in. So definitely, it was definitely connected to this idea of, what can this model that we're teaching you allow you to do when you walk out and you experience the world.
Mm-hmm. So then what you described there, that what if kind of question, strikes me as something that Hattie might describe as transfer learning, applying your thinking, your knowledge to a new situation. And I'm wondering how often, if you, I don't know if you can quantify this, but it would seem to me that if you ask students to do that what if exercise and they make their thinking visible in some way, shape, or form, verbally or visually or whatever, that as a formative assessment as a teacher, and could be for the student as well, if they're thoughtful and metacognitive about things, they may identify things, and you may identify things that they don't understand or don't know because they're of the way that they're talking about it, or that the way that they're thinking about it, which then gives that opportunity to go back and say, all right, we need to make sure that you understand this. And now that thinking becomes visible, and it helps us as a teacher and as a learner to identify the sort of surface learning that might be necessary there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I make this argument quite a lot, is that if your questions are based on restating what's already been taught, you will never know what they understand. So they may be able to say it very well, and you could tick it off and say, well, they've said it, but you don't know what they can do with that knowledge. And what they can do with it is the meaning they've made of it, what they perceive in that knowledge. So then when you ask a what if question, at the end of topics, I like them to write answers. So during lessons, we may say what if and converse, but at the end, I get them all to write an answer, and I read them all. And you all types of things that you never would have picked up otherwise, that they say, and you're like, oh God, they think this, that you never would have got. Then you can go back to the classroom, and then you can talk about it, and that's like, it feels like real teaching at that point. You're really responding to their meaning.
Yeah. How would you characterize the layout of your class typically? And maybe it changes. That's one thing that I see a fair amount of from the sort of science and learning crowd, is that the evidence shows that rows is, minimizes distractions and that kind of thing. And I'm not against rows. I don't know that. I think, to me, it depends on what your outcome is. I'm curious what that looks like in your classroom.
Yeah, my kids are generally in rows because that's how the school is. And I teach with a visualizer, like a document camera. And that's over my piece of paper. And so I'm looking at the class. So I'm sitting down, I've got this camera, and I'm facing all the students. And then I draw a bit, and that's projected on the board. So the students can see it, but I don't have my back to them, so I can see what they're seeing and what their body language. And then I can say, like, what I'm trying to create is this conversation. So my classes are very conversation based, but based around the diagram. So I need all the students to be really seeing the diagram, and then we can talk about it and say, like, okay, well, what's this about? And then I give them time to talk in pairs. And then after they've talked in pairs, we can talk as a class. So we keep switching between these modes, between adding bits to the diagram, and they often they copy the diagrams as well. There's a bit of debate about that, but I like them to do it because there's two reasons really. One is this kind of sensory motor cognition. They're bringing about the diagram themselves. So they're not just watching a diagram. They're building it themselves, and that requires some that thinking about it. Like I'm putting this bit here and not over here.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a bit of stuff in enactive cognitive science about sensory motor cognition, which is where the body itself is the cognitive. It's not just the brain. And then the other one is because it keeps everybody, talking about the same thing. We're all talking about the same thing. We're all doing the same thing. This is a conversation about this idea, and it
Mm-hmm.
helps keep kids from daydreaming and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Would you describe yourself? I mean, I think about it and often talk about sort of teaching and learning often in a sort of spectrum. And in one end, you have the more traditional direct and explicit instruction, science learning, and the worst version of that, and sometimes a caricature of that is that, you've got the drill and kill lecture assess kind of thing. On the other end, you've got what might be described as sort of free school, students learning whatever they want when they want, with teachers just, an adult just sort of being a chaperone to make sure that the place isn't on fire or something like that. Most of us, I think, are somewhere in the middle to one extent or the other. And, I would say, from my perspective, I would say I'm an inquiry-based learning teacher, but also think that knowledge and direct or explicit instruction is part of that. How would you describe your classroom or your teaching approach, either using that spectrum or, any spectrum or any description that you might want to choose otherwise?
It's hard when it's funny because you talk about it. I've thought about it myself quite a few times, and felt that I didn't really match, like you say, somewhere in the middle, but I almost felt like it wasn't on the same spectrum, because it can become so polarized, these
Yeah.
debates, and you're like, I'm not either or, and I'm not really a mix of the two, like and I wondered whether that's because the stuff that I read is often not very popular, and I'm thinking in a quite a different way. So there's an active cognitive science and cybernetics and the biology side of it. I wondered if it was that, but I see my lesson. What would some people say? Like that it's so based on conversation. Would they come and say that it's social constructivism?
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm drawing diagrams and everybody's looking at the diagram. Would they say that I'm like just telling them?
Mm-hmm.
And really, what we could call it, like, and let's call it an activism, and it all of my teaching builds from that distinction we talked about at the beginning. If you have these like fundamental assumptions, and the most fundamental assumption for me is that we are closed to meaning cannot come into us. You have to make that meaning, and then I build my teaching around this, and it's like seeing this would be known in an activism as like autonomous beings. We're completely autonomous. You cannot like control my thoughts or meaning making. So if we're completely autonomous, it's nothing like Engelman's faultless communication. That is like behaviorism or computer metaphor. It's that the faultless communication is this idea that I can control, and if I explain it in this way, you will get the meaning that I get, and if you don't, there's something wrong with your information processing. It's that type of idea. Whereas in activism would be like, no, you cannot. The meaning cannot come into me. So if you don't see it the way I see it, it's because you've perceived it in a different way. And therefore we have to converse to find out what you're perceiving and what I'm perceiving, and come to an agreement. And if we start off with these basic fundamental assumptions, my whole class just comes from this. And I think, is this one end of the spectrum or the other? I don't know. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure even whether this dichotomy is useful in that sense, or if you know what I mean. Am I doing something?
Right.
I don't know if I'm actually doing something different that's not on that spectrum.
Yeah. Well, you got to take a side. I mean, come on. Everything is one side or the other these days. So the efficiency is a word that comes up a lot in cognitive science and science of learning, of which I think is important. But I often make the argument that efficiency, while often an important outcome or feature of teaching and learning, isn't always the most important. And I also think there's some ways to think about learning that, you know, because oftentimes it's so quantitative, right? It's like, do you know this? Let's report that out. And did they remember this? And the qualitative pieces that we want to think about with learning, and so the sort of long-term sort of crystallization of thinking as things come together, and that may in the long run actually be more efficient. It's hard to measure, and that's a problem. But how do you think about efficiency? I mean, I hear you talk about the ways in which your instruction looks, and it seems quite efficient. But then somebody would, as you said, hear you having all these conversations and say that's quite inefficient. So how do you think about that sense or that dynamic of efficiency in your teaching and learning?
Maybe I could take a different point of view on efficiency and think that a lot of schools in the UK, the last school I worked in, they seem kind of sad places at the moment. And I think a lot of that is this high stakes pressure and too much focus on efficiency. So some people will say every second counts. And then you think, well, how does that look for like 7 hours a day if you're a kid, that level of intensity, I suppose I've learned a lot from moving to Spain, having a Spanish family, and I work in this kind of hybrid school. Our kids are Spanish and we have Spanish teachers with us, and they have such a more laid back view. And our days are long. The kids are in 9 till 5. And you think, wow, 9 till 5, how many lessons do they have a day? Like 8 lessons, I don't know. Sometimes they start at 8 in the morning. And you think every second counts, mate. It's going to kill me as much as it's going to kill them, and this is just one day of the week. And then you think, how many days in a year of just like this kind of drudgery of so a lot of times, my lessons start maybe 5 minutes late because I've had to walk from another classroom. And I've got to set up my laptop and my camera. And I think in the UK, people would look at me and say, what, 5 minutes? Every second counts, like 5 minutes. And then they'll do some sort of calculation where it says the amount of learning lost in a year. And so,
right.
And they'll say, well, you should have done some retrieval questions. And it's just like, what I let them do? While I'm setting up my camera, I let them chill out and talk, because they've just had a lesson. And those 5 minutes, the most important part of those 5 minutes is actually just turning off. And relaxing. So, okay, that's one point of view. I don't know if you want to mention anything about that before I talk about teaching.
No, I mean, I certainly, that resonates with me. And as a teacher, I taught for 15 years, and I would say much the same thing. It's I saw somebody recently talking about the things that you would have up in your classroom, posters or things like that. We shouldn't have too much because it'll be distracting to kids, and I certainly take that point. I mean, we certainly don't want to overload kids with too much, but I also think I actually decorated my classroom with a lot of things that were non-educational, just interesting pictures and things that I thought at some point they need to stop looking at me and take a brain break, and that's anybody who's a science learning advocate and efficiency advocate is probably pulling their hair out right now, but I take your point. So I guess then the second part maybe is like, what's the sense of efficiency or prioritization of efficiency inside of a lesson once you've started, right?
Yeah. I think I've definitely been in the past, earlier in my career, more intense, should we say, in the lessons, like in terms of efficiency, like we've got to get through this. I've got to get through this explanation because I've got these questions that you've got to do and you've got to answer them and then you've got to mark them yourself. And that's completely gone. In fact, like I have like a lot of teachers now, they say, have you got like resources? And I'll say, have you got questions so I can just give the students questions, and in the past, I used to have questions or like examples from standardized exams that you would use. And as what I find now is I have absolutely zero time to be giving questions to students because the the whole lesson is just conversation and building something together. And that building something together, yeah, there is I can't take a week to do something which I could normally do in one day. Yeah, because you've got to cover a certain amount because the teacher next year is expecting, and you're part of a system, and they've got standardized exams,
Right.
all of this stuff. But now it is much more like, I'm going to get through this lesson through conversation. If by the end of the lesson they're not, I don't agree that they see it the way I want them to see it, we'll go into next lesson, and then we'll work on it some more. And I want to make a distinction here, because I think some people that are more on the spectrum towards the drill and kill sort of end, they would say the same, like, we'll go into the next lesson. But I mean, when they'll go into the next lesson means that they'll go into the next lesson if they haven't covered all the stuff that they had planned to cover, which what I'm saying is, I will go into the next lesson if I feel my students don't get it, which is different, because I'm dealing with what matters is the meaning making, and not the coverage of certain tasks and content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's always a balance, and you're articulating it well. I do have a couple other questions, and certainly I'm curious at any thoughts that you have on AI, but I want to make sure, because we haven't talked, you mentioned, and I failed to mention it in the discussion here, certainly will in the intro, but you've written at least two books that I'm aware of, Biology Made Real, Ways of Teaching That Inspire Meaning Making. That's 2023, and then Difference Maker, Enacting Systems Theory in Biology Teaching. So both of those are about biology. I'm curious, kind of what the sort of elevator pitch is for those, so folks are aware of them. But then I'm also curious because those are both about biology, I'm curious how you see, or to what extent you think the sort of thinking or takeaways might be applicable to things outside of teaching, outside of biology.
Yeah, I mean, I always want my work to be as honest as possible. And I could have put titles that were whiz bang and everybody will, learn from this book and I'll sell loads, but really, I'm a biology teacher, and the way I see things comes from a history of my teaching and what I've studied, and I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm more involved in an active cognitive science, which is a cognitive science based on the biological side. So when I write that these books are for biology, it was because that's where I'm coming from, and I don't want to make these assumptions that I say this, that there's too much of this, do this in any subject, and it's right. I'll tell you a bit about the book. The first book, Biology Made Real, was, that title is making it real for the students, and what is real to them, instead of it being just some sort of academic pursuit that they'll forget about later. It's like making something real for them. That book was mainly an exploration, kind of almost philosophical, historical, but also pedagogical exploration of what biology is in this century. In other words, what is meaningful to our students? And I lay down a claim that the most meaningful thing for a biology student is what it means for the whole organism, because they are whole organisms. In other words, what it means for them, and what it means for what they can do. What does it mean to be an animal, and ultimately identity? What am I? What does it mean to be human in this world? And when we're studying other organisms like plants, they project that on a plant, and too much of biology is about memorizing parts, when really the interest is like, how is a plant similar to me? And you emphasize with the plant as an organism that's living like you are. So it was based on this idea, and then I explore that as a kind of like curricular, and what does this mean for curriculum and teaching? I would recommend that only for biology teachers, really, science teachers. Difference Maker, though, is kind of a different beast of a book, and it took a different avenue and went into teaching, and its focus is much more on how I teach in the classroom, specifically. The examples are all based on my teaching. Like I have, like, the biggest example is 3,000 words. It's one lesson, and it says what I drew at what moment, what I asked the students, what they said, why I asked that, what I did next because of what they said, and it really goes into this, and that's based on mainly this kind of enactivism and cybernetics, and I ally that with the variation theory of learning. I think that book is much more applicable to other subjects, and it really works off these fundamental assumptions that I've been talking about today. Mainly that meaning cannot be transmitted. You have to engage in conversation, and it builds from these theories from enactivism and cybernetics that were based on these ideas. And then it says this, this is how I do it in the classroom, and this is why I do it. And it's very, very, as much as I could, practical oriented towards this is teaching. If you get these assumptions together, which I've got together, this is what can emerge as like as a way of being in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm looking at and folks can get it on Amazon. We'll put the link to it in the show notes, but I like how you, or at least I don't know, you probably didn't write this, but it's in the Amazon description, talking about meaning not being transmitted or discovered, which is, kind of what we've talked about here, especially the transmission piece. And if you want to say anything more about discovery, that's the conflation that I continue to just, it drives me bonkers, of inquiry learning is discovery, and clearly that's not the case, but discovery learning is a form of inquiry. But so you say it's not transmitted or discovered, but co-constructed, and I like that terminology. So it also talks about the teaching model, recursive teaching model, and then, as you mentioned, detailed examples of your lessons. So folks, thinking about, or wanting to know more about your thinking, that sounds like a really good book to pick up. And if you want to say anything more about discovery, because we haven't really talked about that. We talked more about the science of learning kinds of pieces. And
I've got something you might like,
Okay.
Just now, from responding to what you're saying, I've just written a paper that's been submitted to a journal in England, professional journal for teachers. And its title is, would you believe it, Meaning Can't Be Transmitted. And it's where I kind of formalize this idea. But at the end, I refer to Francisco Varela, who was like this core scientist behind enactivism. And he wrote a paper that was called Not One, Not Two. And what he said was, we got these dichotomies in the world that we talk about, and in education, people always talk about this dichotomy, false dichotomy, and this thing. And he said they've got these dichotomies, and they seem unresolvable lots of times, which I think is what you're referring to now. Mm-hmm. Is it transmission? Is it discovery? So what he said was, you have to resolve this. You have to go to a higher level, and at this higher level, you look down, and you see, you put these two things that are in dichotomy in a way that one leads to the other. And so what I read at the end of this paper, you could see that if meaning can't be transmitted, then basically all learning is a type of discovery. Even when you've got like kind of Engelman direct instruction, if the meaning can't be transmitted, the student has to make meaning. That is in a way a type of discovery. So what I do is, at the end, I could say, we could look at this and we could say that explicit teaching, if you want to say it, is something that leads to discovery.
Say a little bit more about that. I think I'm getting what you're pitching, but put a little more meat on that bone, if you would.
Yeah, and it all comes. A lot of the work that I like is like when you set out these fundamental assumptions at the beginning, and then you say like, okay, well, if it's a bit like maths, in maths you basically got addition, subtraction and multiplication and division, and then from there you say, okay, well, what can we do with these things? And you've got these small few little rules, and then you can build all this kind of complexity. Like a chess game is quite simple, has a few simple rules, but then you can explore all of these ideas, like, oh, what can we do now then in chess? And you can explore all these ideas. So what I'm doing with this is I'm bringing these kind of set of rules, and that core rule, the number one rule, is that we're closed to meaning. Meaning cannot come in to the body. If that is a rule that we take and say that, okay, meaning can't come in, but meaning is something that has to be made by the individual, then there is no teaching, there is no transmission in that sense that's possible. The student can only be provoked to make meaning in this sense. You can only trigger the person. So I've said quite a lot in this podcast now, but I doubt that the meaning you've made of the things I've said is the same meaning that I have in my mind of what I'm saying. But I triggered you some thoughts, and I provoked you to make some ideas. But all of those ideas are controlled by you. I can't control those. You are like this autonomous being. So that's in the sense that if that is true, then that meaning making is almost like a type of discovery. You're discovering new meanings all the time, you know. Mm-hmm. So I keep talking about this idea that we're closed to meaning, and that might have provoked you to think. And you're like, what does he mean by it's closed to meaning? What does that mean for me? And what does that mean for my teaching? And suddenly these new ideas, and you start putting things together, and it's like, whoa, you've discovered something, if you want to call it that, or you could call it you've made meaning of it in a way, and now you perceive things in a different way because maybe it's an idea that somebody's not provoked you with before. It's like that's what I talk a lot about in Difference Maker at the very beginning. I say that you can only provoke students, or trigger students to learn. You cannot make them learn. In the same way you can't get a donkey to drink, you can only take it to the water.
Right.
So then this is the idea. What I was saying is that if you can only provoke them, you can only trigger them to act, mentally act, then teaching is really a road towards kind of a personal discovery. Everything is a discovery.
Yeah, and not to be confused with what people, especially science and learning folks, would characterize as discovery learning, which is not giving any particular guidance and students just going about their business without any stimuli or phenomenon or addition transmission from the teacher. The way you're describing that, it partially, or at least it makes me think about why I think it's important to distinguish between thinking and learning. We want students to think about the things we want them to think about, and in ways we want them to think about, and learn about things we want them to learn about. And sometimes I talk about the difference between push teaching and pull teaching. So push is more that transmission. Pull is, how do I get what's in their heads out? How do I get them to think about things and in ways that I want them to think, which I think is kind of what you're talking about. Like, how do I provide them with information, a stimulus, a drawing, a question, a fact, whatever it might be, some sort of phenomenon, stimuli that gets them to surface and think about things that I want them to think about, or in ways. And that's a real sort of, I think, art and skill of teaching. You have to know your content well. You have to know the cognitive path. Again, that's at architect to architect that, because that stimuli, that question, that prompt, whatever it might be, is it's really important, because if you're asking the wrong question or presenting the wrong information or whatever that might be, you're not going to get the thinking that you're after to then help you be responsive as a teacher, and for the student to, I guess, discover the meaning, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Like this is why I like the word provoke. I really like it in terms of teaching, because it reminds you that you're not in control, that you're only setting a bunch of, like you said, stimuli. We could say prompts, provocations. You're setting out a scene for them to perceive, and then they have to make meaning of that. Like I think Ferenc Martin, who is the person behind the variation theory of learning, he called his book, The Necessary Conditions of Learning. And I just love that title, The Necessary Conditions of Learning, because it gives you that idea that of provocation, the conditions, not I'm just going to tell you.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. We talk about, excuse me, we talk about the difference between intentional inquiry and intuitive inquiry. And you could say intentional instruction or intuitive instruction, and to broaden that. But intentional is that sort of prescriptive kinds of things, and you want to have those things in place. Ask you about planning, you want to have that sort of steps that you're planning on engaging students in, but having then that in place, you can be intuitive as you're responsive because, as you say, you get in there and you're like, oh, they don't understand this, or if I say this, or if I show this, or have that stimuli or provocation, to use your word, then it is likely anticipating, you're perceiving, hopefully accurately, and I think that's a really important skill for teachers, is that you're perceiving accurately what you can do or say or provide that will provoke that thinking. But you have to have the intentional pieces in place before you start. Otherwise, you're likely to get lost and not get where you are hoping to
Yeah,
get.
yeah, definitely. That's like my diagram. My diagram, I see it as a series of provocations that I'm designing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm mindful of time and I've loved our conversation. I am curious, though, one last question before I leave you some space to share any links or things like that. But what do you think about AI? As a systems thinker, I imagine you might have some interesting thoughts to share on that.
I've read more of what the inactivists think of AI, and um, in terms of like systems, first of all, is the idea that AI doesn't think; it just it's a statistical machine that kind of like mirrors us. What would it do in education? There is Nicholas Luhmann's work on his was like systems theory applied to society, and if you can think of if we could transfer the distinction I've been making, I've been saying that I can't control you. You're like an autonomous being, um, and so I can just provoke you in these sort of ways. This Luhmann's work was the same. He took these ideas to society, and he said, like, say, like a school is an autonomous unit that has its own system of actions and interactions. The people are in there, and it just receives provocations from the outside, but you can't control the school. So if you think of it that way, AI is not necessarily going to disrupt schools, but the school as a system that's working as it does may take in AI and just use it within the established practices that it already has. It's not something that can control schools. The school is a system that works the way it does, and it could just be incorporated into schools, and they just carry on going as they are.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm mindful of time. I know you're on Blue Sky, and I think you've left Twitter. Your handle on Blue Sky is Seymour Anderson. Any other places? I know you have your website with blogs and you have a couple of books, but tell folks where they should find you.
I mean, my blog is called Teaching Biology, and it's I'm not sure what the link is now, but if you search for my name and you search Teaching Biology, you find it. And then I've got a ton of blog posts, and the links to my books and my papers are all there. Yeah, but Blue Sky is where I am now. I went off Twitter for ethical reasons, really. I'm not going to go back. And I'm also in some Facebook groups for biology teachers, but Blue Sky is my main site. Yeah, so come in, and it's a great site. I like Blue Sky. People should come and talk more.
Yeah, it's definitely got some distinct differences from Twitter, or X as it's now called. The education pieces seem to be at least a little more reasonable in many ways, but time will tell. Anything else that you want to say before we sign off?
No, no, I don't know. Like I said, I think what emerged was what it was, and I liked it.
Okay, well, great. Appreciate the conversation and be well.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.